around that, and I'll go with it. So, perfect. So we have with us today, in the first hour, we have basically 4 witness groups who will be speaking to us. Each witness group has 5 minutes for opening statements, and then we go to 2 rounds of questioning. We have with us Alpha Fix Capital. We have the managing director, Sébastien Réaume. We have the portfolio manager responsible for investment. It says partners, I guess. I think that's what it says. Simon Sénégal. Then from the Chambre de commerce du Canada, nous avons Jessica Brandon-Epp, directrice principale politique des services fiscaux et financiers. Nous avons Brian Detchou, directeur principal ressources naturelles environnementales. Brian Detchou, responsible for natural resources.
We also have Mr. Terence Keeley from the Impact Evaluation Lab and from the Insurance Bureau of Canada, Jason Clark, the National Director, and Rachel Berry, the Manager. So we will start with Alpha Fix Capital. I believe Mr. Réaume will probably begin. For 5 minutes. Thank you. I am the co-founder for Alpha Fix Capital, a file management company. We work out of Montreal, and we are
as first green bond fund, and the main objective of that fund was really to facilitate the financing of projects which would have a positive impact in terms of the environment, such as renewable energy, public transportation, or green buildings. I'm very proud to say that we have financed since 2017 more than $10 billion of such projects. However, we have had very limited success in terms of helping decarbonize the energy infrastructure industry, which is the reason we're here today. And if we all together, Canada doesn't raise to this challenge, there's a good chance that part of this industry might appear to disappear. And when we look at the success we've had with our Green Bond Fund, we were here to express some ideas in terms of how we could recreate that success and help the oil and gas industry decarbonize to meet Canada's objectives. So I'm joined here with Simon Sénécal, who's going to walk you through some ideas in terms of what are the missing pieces that might be helpful to help decarbonize the energy infrastructure sector. Simon.
Bonjour, merci Sébastien.
Hello, thank you, Sébastien. We look at the net zero emission scenario of the International Emission Agency. They said that in 2050, 23% of energies will be fossil fuels. In Canada, 31% of decarbonization efforts must come from the oil and gas sector in order to reach our net zero emission goal in 2050. 16% from the electricity production, and we have to make an effort on that side too. I invite you to ask questions on electricity production as well. Here's what you must remember. The challenge ahead of us is huge. It's been a little while, but the government has already set out the steps for a transition. So there are requirements for emitters, and they are pretty strict, which is great. That's exactly what we want. We want to decarbonize the industry. There are also some guidelines for projects that companies can finance to decarbonize their projects. However, there isn't a good enough list of projects, and they're not strict enough. That would help us for the decarbonization strategy. So the emphasis here will be on decarbonization so that we don't, get confused with a bunch of different definitions. And it's important for us to remain pragmatic. At Alpha Fix, we have a list of exclusions. They exclude companies that are engaged in extractivist activities, and we also have a commitment. So the Net Zero Asset Manager Initiative. By 2030, we want 100% of our investments to be aligned with a decarbonization plan, aligned with science to respect the 1.5 degree Celsius climate change. So fossil fuels, whether it's extractivist companies, Enbridge, Suncor, just to name a couple. I'm not saying they're worse than the others, but there are efforts being made by all these companies, and they should all be sold by 2030 in our on our side if nothing changes. We are not the only ones who think like this. That is an important risk for the financial market in Canada, because just in case, everybody tries to leave at the same time. With regards to taxonomy, the taxonomy would be helpful for companies to understand what kind of company is aligned with these requirements, but it would help us as investors as well to see what kind of behavior certain companies should be engaging with as social citizens, or rather corporations. 23% of the companies involved are directly linked to fossil fuels, but they contribute to 84% of the carbon emissions. So you see our leverage in our market. We want to engage in a conversation with these companies in order to influence them. What we recommend is the implementation of a clear and strict taxonomy that would help fossil fuel companies to adopt a decarbonization or transition strategy that is based on science. We also would like to impose a minimum percentage of investments in Canada to be in decarbonization projects. We must stop there. I give you a little bit more time. So we will now turn towards, I believe Mr. Brendan Epp will give the opening statement.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair, honorable members. Je vous remercie de nous donner l'occasion de...
Thank you for giving us the opportunity to contribute to the conversation today.
For you on behalf of 400 chambers of commerce and boards of trades and more than 200,000 businesses of all sizes from all sectors of the economy and from every part of our country. Tout d'abord, permettez-moi de souligner que la Chambre de commerce du Canada importance primordiale.
We recognize the importance of reaching net zero the net zero goals from coast to coast, and it is important for our members to succeed in the transition to clean energy, as we represent not only the sectors and companies most involved in this transition, but also the communities across the country that they support.
We acknowledge that climate change poses a significant challenge to business, from the high cost of disruptive events to increased uncertainty for companies in what and how they should invest. Our financial system is, of course, also exposed to these risks. According to the SFAC Secretariat, Canada faces an annual investment gap of $115 billion to achieve its net zero transition goals. Even with federal investment in decarbonization, a significant gap persists. With the federal government nearing its fiscal capacity, provinces and municipalities will also face increased climate-related expenses. Business capital investments in climate and clean tech reached 14 billion Canadian dollars last year, as reported by RBC. However, business capital investments needs to increase, as do contributions from public markets, private equity, and venture capital. To fund, scale, and support innovative green technologies, a collaborative effort between government, industry, and investors is essential. This cooperation will equip the Canadian economy with the necessary tools and support to realize its net zero ambitions.
But before we can talk about Canada's broad investment in net zero across government and the private sector, we first need to ensure that Canada is a competitive environment for investment writ large. New tax increases that foster uncertainty and phase-outs of incentives that stifle investment and signal to the world's innovators to look elsewhere are not helping to attract or retain the kind of entrepreneurs and investors that are going to advance bleeding-edge, made-in-Canada net zero solutions. Additionally, investors require clarity, guidance, and data about opportunities to invest in Canada's net zero transition in order to accelerate capital flows, create the jobs of tomorrow, and grow our economy. Without access to this information and these tools, Canada cannot be globally competitive in fueling net zero investment. Canada should adopt a common definition for what constitutes investment that supports net zero. Greater transparency on Canada's transition plans would help track progress, facilitate accountability, and help the private sector plan investment strategies. In addition, the development and standardization of climate-related transition and physical risk disclosures, ideally with as much harmonization as possible, while accounting for Canada's unique challenges and opportunities, will enable organizations to track and accelerate their progress, provide information and confidence to investors. Initial guidance issued by OSFI is a positive step. It is worth noting that many of Canada's largest federally regulated financial institutions participated on the government's Sustainable Finance Action Council, which has made a variety of recommendations to advance progress towards developing and building a strong and successful sustainable finance marketplace. These recommendations have not yet advanced. In the absence of standardized Canadian-specific guidance, a patchwork of various standards and guidance has emerged within Canada and around the world, leaving businesses and investors frustrated and confused as to why as they plan and navigate their net zero ambitions. All the while, Canada gets farther from achieving its goals and attracting the kind of investment that will grow and sustain our economy for generations to come. The Canadian Chamber's Green Transition Finance Council and Net Zero Council are ready and willing to support. My colleague Brian and I will be pleased to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll go now to Mr. Keeley for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for the opportunity to speak today. Business and finance have crucial roles to play in forging national and transnational outcomes, including greater social inclusivity and environmental sustainability. But their most appropriate roles have been increasingly maligned and misunderstood as climate hysterics have become commonplace. Understanding the optimal role of business and finance in forging the social, environmental, and economic outcomes we all desire requires a sober analysis of the challenge of climate change itself, as well as a deeper appreciation of essential fiduciary rules, the determinant roles of consumers and regulators, and the ancillary role of commerce. Financiers and businesses have no special powers nor any innate responsibility to right others' wrongs or turn the carbon clock backwards. Achieving a more inclusive, sustainable economic growth model requires that regulators, public policies, civic society, and individuals coalesce along with corporations around very specific patterns of behavior. Let me state this more plainly. If consumers continue to demand ever-rising quantities of fossil fuels, it is the responsibility of fossil fuel producers to provide those resources as cleanly and as cheaply as possible. Full stop. The challenge of climate change is daunting. It consists of two intractable problems wrapped into one. The first is a collective action problem. Today, 3 countries, China, India, and Russia, account for more than twice the greenhouse gas emissions generated by the European Union and the North American continents combined. Unless and until China, India, and Russia adopt equally ambitious targets for emissions as this body and much of the rest of the Western world already have, the prospects for achieving the goals of the Paris Accord, namely net zero by 2050, is itself zero. Aligning one's financial system to an outcome that is highly unlikely to be achieved guarantees financial and macroeconomic underperformance. If I have one piece of advice for this committee, it is this. Avoid a great deal of economic and financial sacrifice for no apparent gain. Imposing a wrongly conceived paradigm upon your financial system would serve no useful purpose. Given ESG investment strategies have underperformed broader, more diversified strategies by more than 250 basis points per annum over just the last 5 years, the cost to individual Canadian pensioners over time would almost certainly amount to tens of billions of dollars of lost income. The second dimension of our climate challenge is a multivariable optimization problem. Canada, like every other country, is duty-bound to have a national energy policy that is clean, affordable, reliable, and ideally abundant. After all, energy security is part of national security. Canada is blessed with abundant choice between oil and gas, nuclear, hydro, wind, and to a lesser extent, solar. Exploit your advantages. Most other nations are not as fortunately situated. China and India continue to rely upon coal for more than half of their electricity supply. Given their needs for economic growth, it is wholly unreasonable to expect that India, Nigeria, Indonesia, and dozens of other countries, which collectively account for 2/3 of global population, will dramatically alter their production and use of fossil fuels in manners consistent with Paris-mandated objectives. Pope Francis himself wrote in his encyclical Laudato Si, "We are not faced with separate crises, one environmental, another economic, but rather one complex crisis with multiple challenges. Solutions demand an integrated approach. We must combat poverty, restore dignity to the excluded, and protect nature all at the same time." I am not a climate denier. The evidence for anthropomorphic impacts on our land, air, and water is in plain sight, available for everyone to see. Given our collective action failures and multivariable needs, however, global temperatures are heading higher. This means in the mitigation versus adaptation debate, public policy should lean more heavily towards adaptation. The globe has never had to sustain 10 billion souls simultaneously. It will soon have no choice. How 10 billion souls sustainably occupy our planet in the centuries to come remains among humanity's most significant challenges. And climate risk certainly portends significant economic and financial risk, as everyone on this panel will say. All this said, government regulations which force Canadian pension plans to restrict their investments into climate-aligned indices or strategies will not help create a climate-aligned world. Canadians can divest their way to a green portfolio, but they cannot divest their way to a green globe. Decarbonizing industrial production requires massive amounts of investment, not divestment. Moreover, divestiture does not stop companies from making unwanted decisions. It merely impacts their cost of capital and transfers ownership from those who don't support a given management team and strategic direction to those who more broadly do. Responsible investors allocate capital most wisely when they properly anticipate the world that will be, not some imagined hope-for world that has a very low probability of bearing out. In practice, this requires investing in a very broad range of companies, industries, and real assets, including many brown ones, with significant prospects for becoming more green. It also involves the provision of patient capital to the most promising technologies that lower what Microsoft founder Bill Gates has called the green premium, which is the difference between existing practice and less carbon
Unfortunately,
intensive.
we're going to have to stop there, but I'm sure there will be many questions. So whatever points we're upcoming.
Green bonds.
Well, that's good. We're a nice committee. We like to hear nice stuff like that. So we'll go now to I guess it's Mr. Clark who will be, go ahead, Mr. Clark.
Thank you, Chair. I'm pleased to be here today on behalf of the Insurance Bureau of Canada and its members to speak about our advocacy on climate change that relates to the impacts on the Canadian financial system. IBC is the National Industry Association representing home, auto, and business insurers. Our members make up the vast majority of the property and casualty insurance market in the country. For 60 years, IBC has worked with governments and insurance regulators across the country to help make home, auto, and business insurance available and affordable for Canadians. The reality is that Canada is becoming a riskier place to live, work, and insure due to the level of risk we face from extreme weather events as a result of climate change. To date, regulatory discussions concerning climate risk disclosure and the ongoing work to establish a green taxonomy inadequately consider physical risk and have overemphasized transition risk in relative terms. For a country where natural disasters have consistently disrupted economic activity, this emphasis should be reversed. Last summer, as wildfire smoke from Quebec blanketed Ottawa and parts of the eastern seaboard, I walked outside with my 4.5-year-old son who said, "Dada, it smells like camping." In 2023, Canada faced the worst wildfire season in its history, with over 6,600 fires that burned more than 18.5 million hectares, forcing the evacuation of at least 155,000 people from their homes, all at a cost of more than $1.4 billion just to fight these fires. These wildfires led to the cumulative release of CO2 equivalent to the global airline industry's emissions in a single year. And the challenge that we are faced with right now is that this year could be even worse. We are also seeing that flooding events are becoming more severe. As of today, 1.5 million households in Canada are built in areas of high risk of coastal, riverfront, and urban flooding. These households lack affordable and adequate insurance. Over the past 8 years, IBC has advocated for a low-cost national flood insurance program for high-risk households in partnership with our industry to close this protection gap. Budget 2024 confirmed that the government intends to launch such a program next year in 2025. Last year, severe weather events in communities across Canada caused $3.5 billion in insured damage alone, one of the highest annual totals in the previous 4 decades. But unlike in 2016, when a huge wildfire ravaged Fort McMurray and caused a quarterly contraction in national GDP, the losses last year weren't attributed primarily to one single catastrophe. Instead, climate-related disasters affected almost every part of Canada. Because of the threat of more frequent and intense natural disasters in all part of the country, we support the federal government's commitment in Budget 2024 to develop a green taxonomy, which represents an opportunity to catalyze new investments. However, our industry believes that the greatest challenges in this country are from the physical risks we face from climate change, and greater efforts need to be focused on driving capital to enhance resilience. Canada's P&C insurers have been at the front lines of climate change for many years, sounding the alarm with governments and regulators, proposing policy solutions, and pricing and managing climate risks. In fact, OSFI recently highlighted the industry's leadership in the What We Heard report, following their survey of financial institutions on readiness to implement Guideline B15, climate risk management. The report notes P&C insurers are further ahead than other financial institutions in establishing climate-related risk reporting and metrics, and it recognizes P&C insurers' experience in managing physical risks such as weather-related and natural catastrophes. The report also found that P&C insurers are further ahead than others on formalizing climate-related roles and responsibility for board members and senior management. As we reduce our emissions, Canada must also urgently improve its climate defenses. This includes investing in new infrastructure to protect communities from floods and fires, improving building codes, ensuring better land use planning, and increasingly creating incentives to shift the development of homes and businesses away from high-risk areas. Further, to rapidly advance resilience measures, IBC co-founded Climate Proof Canada, a national coalition that I'm fortunate enough to chair, which has played an important advisory role in helping establish the country's first national adaptation strategy. For more than a decade, IBC has been warning governments about the need to be better prepared for severe weather events as a result of climate change. We believe Canada must play both offense and defense when it comes to climate change and take action today to protect Canadians from the growing threat to their homes and well-being. We look forward to this committee's continuing study of the environment and climate-related impacts of the Canadian financial sector and the role that property and casualty insurers are already playing. Thank you for the invitation to speak, and we look forward to hearing.
Merci, merci beaucoup. Alors, on tombe dans le premier.
Thank you very much. So now we are going to start the first round of questions, and we will start with Mr. Mazier. Floor is yours.
Thank you for the witnesses that are coming out this afternoon. Mr. Keeley, my questions will be for you this afternoon. Can a government meet their environmental targets by regulating the financial system or mandating climate risk disclosures?
I think, as I said in my opening remarks, that for us to achieve a net zero world, we're going to have individuals, public policies, a wide range of other forms of taxes and to create the world that we want to see. Businesses are in an ancillary position. They're not in a leading position. So to actually say that we can regulate business and finance to a greener world is, I think, misguided.
The Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions has introduced mandatory climate-related financial disclosure expectations for financial institutions in Canada. What are the risks associated with climate-related disclosures or ESG scores?
Well, any good financier will tell you that having more information is better and more disclosures is better, but it's the question of how that information would be utilized. To the extent, the best example would be that Scope 1, Scope 2, and ideally Scope 3 emissions would be required to be reported. But what would be done with that information is particularly dangerous. To the extent that we are going to result in a situation where we're merely divesting from brown companies, divesting from brown buildings, starving them of capital, will have exactly the wrong answer to our climate problems. We actually need to invest in those industries, not divest.
Is there a financial risk to the retirement savings of individual Canadians if a government attempts to meet environmental targets through pension and investment funds?
That particular risk is huge, daunting, and would almost certainly result in the loss of hundreds of billions of dollars of income over many years to Canadian pensioners. We need to invest in the world that will be, not some imagined world. As we all know, the ESG strategies that have been, there's $45 trillion in ESG strategies. It's not that these strategies are underfunded, dear friends. It's that they simply don't work. And they have been underperforming markets by 250 basis points for the last 5 years. That's going to result, if we continue in that path, underfunded pensions, people that cannot support themselves in their old age.
I forgot to actually expand on the divestment part of this. Will divestment achieve environmental objectives, and should Canadians be concerned with this approach?
I think everyone should be concerned, not just Canadians. I think there was a recent episode with ExxonMobil where we all saw that they were a number of investors voted, they remain shareholders and put in new board members. Right now, ExxonMobil is one of the leading investors in carbon capture. Thank God investors stayed engaged with ExxonMobil to help move them in the right direction. Divestiture is almost certainly the exact opposite of what we require right now to create the world that we want.
And how do you turn that tide? What else can you advise this committee as far as, because that is a common theme in this talk, is get out of the, and it'll just basically, the businesses will die. Is there anything else we can think about divestment and actually maybe something else we should consider there?
I think that debate is now raging on college campuses across the United States. As we all know, everybody's calling for the divestiture of Amazon, the divestiture of companies that they think will somehow end fighting in Gaza. We have to understand how limited divestiture is as a tool for solving our problems. Divestiture is not the way to go if you're actually trying to influence a corporation's behavior or affect an economic outcome.
You've stated, and I quote, committing to net zero portfolio target today is somewhat like agreeing to a gluten-free diet before knowing which foods contain gluten or what nutrients one might be sacrificing in the process, end quote. Can you explain what you mean by this?
Well, thank you for reading my book. At least somebody has. It's very clear that we don't know what this divestiture movements will actually create. That $45 trillion that I spoke about is largely based upon divestiture. And many, many individuals have adopted these ESG indices that MSCI and others are coming out with. And they're basically signing up for investing in less than 1/2 of the investable market. Of the 500 corporations in the S&P 500, only 230 are currently fully aligned with net zero 2050. Why would anybody decide that they're only going to invest in those companies when, in fact, it is the browner ones that have the chance to become better corporations and outperform over time?
If pension and investment funds adopt net zero portfolios, would this do anything to achieve a net zero world?
Clearly not. A green portfolio does not create a green world. If it did, we would have gotten rid of smoking, gambling, alcohol, tobacco, firearms. All of these have been divested from over decades, and yet you can still grab a pack of cigarettes and have a beer. Divestiture has not worked to solve the underlying problems.
Bill Gates has said, and I quote, ESG investing so far has probably not removed 1 ton of carbon out of the air. Do you agree with this statement? And if so, what are the implications of allocating trillions of dollars in capital to ESG portfolios that do not reduce a quantifiable amount of emissions?
I think Bill Gates just summarized, as we have been discussing, the limited efficacy of divestiture as a tool for changing the world and changing industry. That's what Bill Gates was referring to in that quote. I obviously agree with him. I quoted him in my book.
Thank you. We'll go to Mr. Van Couverton now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thanks to all the witnesses for being here and sharing your vast expertise with us. Many of us, including myself, are just learning about terms. We've all Googled what a sustainable finance taxonomy is in the last couple of weeks, and we're just getting off the grounds here. But and I say that about myself. There are people here that know more about that than me, but these meetings have been really helpful in learning more about that. So my first question is to you, Mr. Clark. I've read that Canada's insured losses over the last couple of years due to wildfires and other natural disaster events that are fueled by climate change, not always caused by climate change, causes a little bit of consternation sometimes in this committee, have increased markedly, and so have the insured losses. Can you talk a little bit about why that's the case and to the degree to which it's true, if it is?
Sure. Thank you for the question. I think the trend line in Canada is pretty clear. We're seeing an increasing frequency and severity of extreme weather events as a result of climate change. And we're seeing, I mentioned in my remarks, a comparison to 2016 in the Fort McMurray fires. Also noting that that's a community that was just had evacuation orders to neighborhoods just days ago, actually. And so what we've seen over the past number of years, and in particular, whether it's 2022, 2023, we've seen $3.4 billion in insured losses alone. That doesn't capture the full loss that we're seeing as a result of these events or these activities. There's also infrastructure loss. There's losses to productivity. There's business loss. So not to mention homeowner loss. So a big part of our work has been to work with the federal government on a low-cost national flood insurance program to help ensure that Canadians are better protected.
Well, thank you for that. I have a follow-up question. I've read recently that upwards of half of the world's displaced people last year due to wildfires were Canadian. Canada's 0.5% of the world's population, but accounted for almost half of the world's displaced people due to wildfires. Do you think it stands to say that Canada actually has more to lose with respect to the impacts of climate change? I've heard that Canada is warming more quickly than other countries. Would you say that's the case?
We are exceptionally concerned about this trend line. We are exceptionally concerned about the conditions that we're seeing. Even just today, the Canadian Hurricane Centre released its expectations of the forthcoming hurricane season, which they noted would be significant or very active, and that aligns with what we've seen out of the U.S. Just announced days ago. So we are, whether it's multi-peril, so whether that's wildfire, flooding, or extreme heat, another very significant threat to Canadian communities across the country, we are exceptionally concerned. Currently, the Canadian insurance, property and casualty insurance industry is very well placed, and we are seeing full coverage with the exception of high-risk flooding, and there's an opportunity to work together on that.
Okay, thank you very much. And given that Canada seems to be more vulnerable because we're a large country, so sometimes it takes more time for emergency services. We have a lot of forests, so we're vulnerable to things like forest fires. We tend to have seasons, and that comes with seasonal weather. Do you think it would be, this is a little bit personal perhaps, do you think it would be responsible, given our vulnerability, to be not one of the leaders lowering our emissions and demonstrating a commitment to fighting climate change globally?
If I look at what we have worked on with respect to the green taxonomy as an example, we think it's important to both reduce emissions and ensure that we're adapting to climate change. The way that we put it is because the country is becoming riskier, we need to play offense and we need to play defense. We think that the work that was done to establish the country's first national adaptation strategy was incredibly important. We've seen $1.6 billion invested so far. I would suggest more needs to be done there. There's additional opportunities. We need to make sure that we're doing things like ensuring that we're not building homes in high-risk zones, so that we're building homes in the right way, so that they're low carbon, but also so that we're not putting them in high-risk, say, flood or wildfire zones. Yes.
And just very, very briefly, does disclosure equal divestment? It seems like there's been a little bit of a direct line drawn on this committee today.
I couldn't speak to divestment on behalf of our members. What I could say is the property and casualty insurance industry has worked very closely with OSFI, our federal regulator, on B15 guidelines to ensure that we are appropriately prepared for climate-related risks, in particular physical risks. And so our concern very much is to ensure the soundness of our industry as it relates to this increasing trend line which we've talked about.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Keeley, with the remaining time I have available, I have a question for you, and it starts with a quote. The quote is, "We have a grave responsibility to ensure that children not be denied their future. The climate run amok is crying out to all of us to halt this illusion of omnipotence. We need a turning point, demonstrating a clear and tangible political will that can lead to a decisive acceleration of ecological transition." Do you know who said that?
I do not know who said it, but I do not. I think disclosure is a good thing. I think that was directed towards me. Disclosures are a good thing. They're not equated with divestment. I wanted to make that point.
I'm glad to hear that, and thank you. The person who quoted that was the Pope. It seems as though in your opening statement, you characterized some of the Pope's positioning as not as a climate activist. He actually is quite a climate activist.
Very much so. He's very much so. And he endorsed my book, by the way, on the cover.
Fabulous. Congratulations.
Unfortunately,
sir,
we're going to...
I have one last question.
Go ahead, very quickly.
Mr. Keeley, do you feel like emissions ought to be measured per capita, per person, or by flag?
I don't know what good any of those would do, but I think that we all should be examining our carbon footprints individually, if that's the question.
Perfect. Okay, thanks. Madame Posey.
Ms. Posey, thank you to all of our witnesses. I have questions for Mr. Sénécal and Mr. Riom. Your company distinguished itself by having the first fund in Canada that is green. In Canada, they have very strict requirements. You are in alignment with the climate bonds taxonomy. Are you familiar with S243? It's finance aligned with climate by Ms. Rosa Valdez. You say that you are. You work in a specific sector. Do you think that this project would encourage stability on Canada's financial markets? Thank you. We are familiar with it. This is a disclosure method related to OSFI and the ISB. If we have more disclosure from banks with regards to their loans, their portfolios, with regards to the risks of their investments in climate, then we assume that they will have to disclose what is necessary. I think that disclosure is a positive thing because it allows investors to make a choice. Putting pressure on them depends on what goal we intend to reach, be it through our own behavior, personal choices, and so on. We need all of these tools in order to provoke change in an economy in which there are multiple stakeholders. AlphaFix has supported the CAFA bill because we think that it will provide more disclosure. Excellent. So more transparency. Do you think that the Canadian financial system is currently ready to face the threat of climate change? It's to say that I think that the Canadian financial system is in good health, and it's difficult to quantify exactly what risks you're referring to. There is still some work to be done. You mentioned disclosure. I'm an investor. We are always trying to evaluate the risks. So more information we have, the better we are, the more tools we have to quantify such things. But to ask if the Canadian system has the right tools now, yes. Well, at our first meeting on this topic, a witness told us that the Canadian financial system is not as successful as we think it is. Our GDP and our productivity is struggling, and there is no uptake on the horizon. So you don't have the same perspective. I would not necessarily attach that to climate change. We obviously do have challenges with regards to productivity, for example, in Canada. the financial system is very robust. I don't think that I'm not worried particularly. With regards to your green fund, that contributed to the funding of renewable energies. In your opinion, what is the approach that would allow us to decarbonize electricity production as quickly as possible in Canada? Green bonds would allow us to do that, but there are places in Canada where the price of electricity can't be fixed ahead of time. It is a market price, and that increases the risk of those projects with regards to being investment. And then there are purchasing power agreements, which make those projects viable and then allow us to spend capital. Right now in Canada, there are places that it's possible, but provincial regulation doesn't allow us to fund those projects because they are not economically viable yet compared to other projects that are not in line with clean energies. So increasing the price of electricity would help. Sorry, I'm having trouble with the microphone. So I'd like to talk about finances again. Earlier you said that the system seems robust, but the OECD published a report on biodiversity, and it says that the capital is not properly distributed. We know that capital is impacted by climate change, and the risks to biodiversity are linked to capital. Earlier, I asked if we were ready to face climate change. I was kind of referring to what the OECD says. I'm going to talk about insurance companies that know a lot about physical risks. Those bring biodiversity risks. Climate risks are more easily quantifiable than the domino effect that those events can have on biodiversity. Our behavior as corporations, as humans, and everything we do to the environment, the domino effect is very high towards biodiversity, and it seems that it's very much more difficult to quantify the measures. We must now move on to Ms. Collins.
I guess I want to start off by addressing one of the comments that was made by the witnesses around climate hysterics. Hysteria, it refers to something that is wildly emotional. It comes from the Greek word womb, of the womb. It is used in ancient Greek to refer to things associated with women. And I hope you'll forgive me if I get emotional. Climate emergencies are not gender neutral. The degradation of ecosystems disproportionately impacts women and girls. And I am wildly emotional. This is the existential crisis of our time. And to hear that we're asking for high ambition is climate hysteria, that makes me wildly emotional. Absolutely. You know, when I think about my womb, you know, the 2 children that I bore from that womb and what future we are leaving them, I am wildly emotional. And it's not surprising to hear this from someone who has written articles that are pro-life. I think that we need to think about the intersection of gender and the climate crisis. And I hope that the people around this table and the people listening will refrain from using language like climate hysteria. We are facing a climate emergency. So I'm going to start off my questions to Mr. Clark. I appreciated your comments about the existential crisis that we're facing. And a handful of insurance companies are already setting net zero goals and climate transition plans. I'm curious how legislative and regulatory mechanisms support insurance companies already doing this work, and really how do we get the ones who aren't, the majority who haven't committed to net zero goals, headed in that direction?
Thank you for the question. I think when we look at our members, when we look at, in particular, the work that we have been doing with OSFI on climate risk disclosure, which I think is incredibly important. In March of 2023, OSFI finalized its draft guidelines on B15, and it established its expectations for climate-related risk disclosures. In terms of where we are at right now, we are working on, our members are currently undertaking, and we're finalizing, they'll be conducting later this year, climate risk analysis on their full operations. And so it is incredibly important for us in order to ensure the soundness of our business so that we're delivering effectively on that. In terms of the one thing I wanted to mention, that in terms of when we think about net zero and we think about the investment portfolio of property and casualty insurers, which is slightly different, we have various restrictions in terms of investment concentration. So if you look at, say, last year, 2023, our invested assets equaled $139 billion, and 72% of that was bonds. So we are, and OSFI puts additional limitations on us to not overly invest in a single company or single industry series of companies in order to ensure that we have the reserves available to pay out for policyholders. So I would say it's incredibly important. We are very seized with climate change and in particular the physical risk side of things that we're already seeing.
And the climate crisis poses an existential crisis, or threat to our society, but it also poses an existential threat to insurance companies. And, because this is becoming more and more high risk, we're seeing, devastating wildfires, flooding, communities impacted so severely by extreme weather. It feels like those costs are being offloaded to consumers. It feels like there are communities that are going to become uninsurable. That really concerns me. And at the same time, insurance companies are also investing and underwriting fossil fuel projects. And so at what point does investing and underwriting fossil fuels violate insurers' fiduciary obligations to their policyholders, especially those who are facing increased risk due to the climate crisis?
So I'm not able to speak to any specific investment or any specific policy that's been underwritten by our members. That's under the Competition Act. I can't speak to that. However, I think when you're talking about the focus on, in particular, the physical risk and the threat and the challenge that we face from a pricing perspective, I think that's very real. We've seen it quite clearly in the last few years. StatsCan's just released updated new data on the impact that is having directly on insurers, and it is also having an impact on consumers in this country as well. And the rationale for that is that what I mentioned in my remarks is that the country is becoming a riskier place. Essentially, policies are priced on risk, and as a community or a household's risk rises without corresponding investments to make sure that we're mitigating that risk, which is incredibly important.
Yeah. Well, I have to stop there. I'm going to next round. I'm going to have to reduce the time by 20%, so it'll be 4 minutes and 2 minutes. I'd go longer, but we didn't get an extension of resources today, but we did ask. Okay, Mr. Leslie, for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Keeley, in your opening statements, you mentioned that ESG investment strategies have broadly underperformed more diversified strategies by a specific number of 250 basis points per annum over the past 5 years. So I'm curious, in terms of real dollar values, what does that actually look like? And if there were to be a Liberal NDP bloc-imposed ESG mandate, how many billions of dollars would you potentially expect the Canadian pension plan, the most important safety net for Canadians, to potentially lose in the coming years?
So the Canadian pension plan, if I understand, is worth right now about $650 billion Canadian. You can just take 2.5% of that per year and subtract it from what it would otherwise be if you continue in the ESG strategies. That, of course, amounts to tens of billions of dollars, really in less than a decade. So it's quite a meaningful sum of money.
Thank you. And globally speaking, are there examples of other nations that have tried to achieve environmental targets via financial systems, and what has the results of those been?
Thankfully, no. There has been a renewed focus on fiduciary rules. I was asking one of my Canadian friends whether or not Canada has the same fiduciary rule as they have in the United States. Fiduciary rules, largely speaking, preclude the investment strategies that are suboptimal, that is to say, achieve poor risk-adjusted returns. I think that I'm not exactly sure of what the Canadian equivalent is of a fiduciary rule, but if you have one, it solves a lot of your problems.
Thank you. And you mentioned in your opening remarks that energy security is part of national security, and obviously we've had many nations come to Canada looking for clean Canadian liquefied natural gas, to which our government has decided that there is no business case because we've made it so difficult for projects to move forward. In your view, would imposing an ESG mandate on financial institutions or pension funds make it even more difficult for Canadian energy projects to access funding potentially?
It almost certainly would be counterproductive in the extreme. That is to say, what you want to do to create a greener world, which I do want to create a greener world, you need to turn brown companies green, and you actually need to stop consuming fossil fuels, and you need to switch to a much cleaner energy mix. In Canada's case, that would be more nuclear. Climate change is a huge challenge, but to describe it as an existential threat is an excellent example, and I won't use the word hysterical, of gross exaggeration that actually clouds clear thinking on the matter.
No, thank you. And I recognize that Canada has some of the most stringent environmental and labor regulations in the world. I'm a believer that we should be exporting our bounty of natural resources around the world rather than have it being produced in countries like, as you mentioned, Russia or China or India or Iran or Venezuela. Is it preferable, in your view, that we produce more in this country versus the countries I just listed or others around the world?
I applaud every member of this committee and all Canadians who are trying to do their part in creating a greener world. I just, as I tried to state in my opening remarks, feel that it's fairly logical and we should continue to expect that temperatures are going higher. So when it comes to prioritizing public assets and public expenditures, the approach of adaptation will be far better spent than mitigation.
In your view, how should we rank the importance of measuring outcomes and results of our policies? And in your view, would a ESG mandate aid the improvement of environmental outcome results in any way?
Very briefly, please. You have 10 seconds.
Yeah. Do I have time or no?
10 seconds.
10 seconds.
Basically a yes or no.
The answer is no.
Longfield for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have one brief question, and I'll turn the rest of my time over to Mr. Turnbull. My question is for Mr. Senecal. You piqued my interest when you talked about electricity and getting to a cleaner grid. A few summers ago, a group of us visited the nuclear facility at Bruce Power. We were talking about green bonds at the time and the opportunity to have nuclear included in Canada's green bond policy. And since, I guess, November 21st, 2023, certain nuclear energy expenditures are now eligible under Green Bond Program. Knowing how important it is to attract international investment into high capital expenditure areas such as nuclear, could you comment on whether we've gone far enough? Is this heading in the right direction?
Thank you for the question. So I think, well, first of all, nuclear was part of the climate bonds taxonomy since like 2018, from what I remember. So it's just that it is, as you all know, a controversial topic. But still, in terms of low carbon solutions to produce electricity, it is up there. It is the lowest type of electricity production. So yes, some issuers in Canada have revised their green bond framework lately. And it is one of the solutions to live in a greener, low-carbon world. So,
thank you. I think it's the change that we've seen in terms of being able to get to medical isotopes, as another example. That Ontario, the Bruce Power said that it was really a missing piece that they needed to see us working on.
I'm sorry, I missed what did they add?
Okay, I think I'm taking up too much time. If I can maybe go over to Mr. Turnbull, please.
I wanted to
Thank you
ask
for your answer.
thanks to my colleague, Mr. Longfield. Ms. Brendan Jepp and Mr. Decho, wanted to ask you, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce has a working group on sustainable finance, as I understand it, and I've met with them quite a number of times, which is great. I know that you've been active advocating for a green taxonomy and mandatory climate-related disclosures. Could you describe why those are so important as enabling conditions to attract additional investment and mobilize capital to fight climate change?
Thank you for the question. And thank you for taking the time to meet with the Canadian Chamber and members of our Green Transition Finance Council. The Canadian Chamber believes that we require an inclusive Made in Canada framework, which addresses the unique opportunities and challenges facing Canada in its transition and supports Canadians in that transition. So really, it's about creating a full suite of tools that businesses and investors can feel confident in and rely on as they make investment decisions.
My understanding is that credibility and certainty within the market is what really are kind of the enabling conditions for capital to flow. Do you see these two tools, taxonomy, which is a classification system for green and transition products, and then disclosure information, which truly, I think, arms investors with decision useful data? Are those two, can you speak to just how important those tools are in terms of increasing credibility and transparency in the market?
Well, certainly, I think businesses have been advocating for these tools for quite some time, and so has SFAC. And so I think in order to increase Canada's productivity and grow our economy, these are really essential to attracting investors. We know that.
Merci. On doit passer. Je m'excuse.
I'm very sorry to cut you off, but our time is tight and short today. Ms. Posey, so 2 minutes. I'll have to go very quickly. First, as a representative to the representative Canadian Chamber of Commerce, in a recent report from 2024 at page 32, it says that the Chamber of Commerce promotes things such as tar sands, pipelines, and so on. And it says that in 2022 that you were against the capping of emissions to a certain amount. But earlier you said that your priority was the fight against climate change. So which one is your priority, the fight against climate change or promoting the oil and gas interests of Canada?
Question.
Thank you for your question. I will answer in English if you'll allow me, because I'm more at ease.
I think the Canadian Chamber of Commerce and many of its members certainly agree that we have a strong role to play in reducing our emissions, and that has been always a focus of many of our members. But I think one thing that we also need to take into consideration is Canada's role in the world and our abilities to support one of our strongest performing sectors. So I'm not just focusing on the sector that you mentioned, but also the critical minerals that we have in this country and our ability to help support other nations as they also try to decarbonize their efforts.
Je m'excuse de vous interrompre.
Sorry to cut you off. I only have 2 minutes. So you do think that there is a link between climate change and fossil fuels. So I have a question either for you or for the Insurance Bureau of Canada. It's about the boards of directors. I want to say that they are maybe infiltrated or influenced by representatives from oil and gas sector. Is there anything that we should be working on? You talked about taxonomy. The Chamber of Commerce talked about it. But if we have to define a taxonomy and representatives from the oil and gas sector are there, then we won't be able to do this. Sadly, we don't have time for an answer, but we've understood what you're trying to get at. Ms. Collins.
Yeah, again, it's not surprising to me that the Conservatives have spent most of their time asking questions about divestment to someone who is maligning the divestment movement. Young people are using so many tools, whether it is divestment, engagement, or activism, and they're trying to use whatever tools they can right now in the face of a climate crisis. It's not surprising also that, the climate neo-denialism, that we don't have to be that ambitious, is aligned with folks who don't fully support a woman's right to choose. It's also, to me, telling that the Conservative leader has refused to say whether he would scrap the industrial carbon price. And my question is to Ms. Brannan-Jepp. The federal backstop when it comes to the industrial carbon price is one of the most critical policies that we have. Industrial carbon pricing does the bulk of our emissions reduction. The Pathways Alliance new head has actually called on the Conservative leader to state his position on the industrial carbon price and whether he would keep. It's wild to me that when we're in a position where oil and gas leaders are more climate friendly than a leader of a political party in Canada. That's wild. But I'm curious from your perspective of creating certainty, what does that kind of uncertainty do?
I think Canada should increase overall net zero funding and do more to de-risk and address barriers to private sector investment. We hear from our members all the time that they very much appreciate partnerships with government and private sector funders to enhance and innovate, find bleeding edge solutions to our greatest climate challenges. And so I think this is really where...
And particularly on the industrial carbon pricing question, is greater certainty better for...
Yeah, 15 seconds, please, on that, yeah.
If I may jump in very quickly, one thing that we've been advocating on very consistently is that certainty and predictability. I think we've seen a number of projects put on hold for a number of different reasons, and I think one of the main reasons for many is that lack of certainty and predictability.
Thank you. Mr. Cram for 4 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I would like to introduce the witnesses from Alpha Fix Capital to our witnesses from the Chamber of Commerce, and I would like our witnesses from the Chamber of Commerce to meet our witnesses from Alpha Fix Capital. It seems that Alpha Fix Capital is a very successful green investment firm with billions of dollars in green bonds and green investment funds. It seems that the Canadian Chamber of Commerce has many good green investment opportunities. So I can't help but wondering, why are you guys spending your afternoon talking with a room full of politicians instead of talking with each other about all these investment opportunities that you could work together on, and instead of asking for more government regulations? And wouldn't it be better if politicians stepped back and let you guys do your thing, and we could have a greener, better economy as a result?
Some of the challenges that we are facing. As successful as we were in our green bonds, the transition has been a much tougher challenge. And we are trying to replicate the success factors in the green bond to the transition world. That's why we're here, just to say there's a piece missing, and that piece is the taxonomy for the transition. And yeah, I'm glad to come here and chat, but I do have other things to do. But at the same time, I think it's important there are some very low-hanging fruits, and that's one of them. So what's holding back the taxonomy? Not sure, but it's holding back investments. As long as companies do not know the rules of the game, do not know where the goalposts are, it's very difficult for them to allocate capital.
And from the Chamber of Commerce, why does the government have to be the one providing the taxonomy? Why can't you guys communicate with each other?
Well, I'm pleased to say that we do regularly communicate with our members. In fact, Brian and I both have councils that do a great inanimate amount of work in this area. And what our members are really telling us is that greater certainty and clarity is required. That said, there are a number of innovative solutions that our members are trying to drive forward, and they're excited to do so, and they're looking to attract more capital to be able to let business be business and innovate and come up with those bleeding edge solutions that are going to drive our net zero ambitions.
Okay, let's come back to Mr. Keeley. Mr. Keeley, in your opening statement, you said, if I have one piece of advice for this committee, it is to avoid a great deal of economic and financial sacrifice for no apparent gain. Could you elaborate on what you meant by that?
Yeah, sure. I think that I think we got into a lot of it in the course of the discussion, which is divestiture. And all of these issues about greater disclosures almost certainly just lead back to the divestiture question. People would end up divesting from those who are dirtier industries, and that's not going to solve things. So I would just, strongly say that if we're going to decarbonize our industries, if we're going to make the grid greener, if we're going to have an effective carbon tax, I would recommend a carbon border adjustment tax, which has been recommended by Paul Ryan. Those would be far more sensible approaches than to impose a net zero portfolio restriction on your pensioners. We need to ask the question, we're all concerned about the climate. It's a horrible situation. The world is outliving its resources. There's no question. But what can Canadian pensioners actually do about that?
Okay, thank you.
I thought that was the question.
Thank you.
And Canadian pensioners do not solve the crisis by divesting.
Yeah. And go to Ms. Taylor-Roy, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to extend my thanks to all the witnesses for taking their valuable time to speak to our committee. As we know, as representatives, we cannot do our jobs without speaking to the people on the front lines. So your being here is very important to our committee's deliberations on this matter. And Mr. Keeley, you've received a lot of questions today. I will not be asking you one, but I did want to thank you because several times you have emphasized that the most important thing we can do is to have consumers stop consuming fossil fuels. And that is exactly what the Price on Pollution program is designed to do. It's to incorporate the environmental costs of consuming fuels into the price signal so that people will, in fact, consume less. So I appreciate your endorsement of those programs. But I would like to talk to the Chamber of Commerce because there seems to be some confusion about the impact of capital flows on businesses and what that does, not only to the businesses, their ability to invest, but also to share prices. I think about the example of Reddit, I think when they shorted GameStop. And it was really interesting. The supply and demand in terms of people investing in certain stocks or disinvesting from certain stocks actually has a great impact on the economic performance of that company in the stock market, perhaps not fundamentally. And so this idea that somehow we cannot make any difference by directing the flow of capital to those companies which are in green pursuit seems to me to be misguided. And I was wondering to Jessica, I'm sorry, I've forgotten your last name. I wrote down your first name. But to Jessica, if you could talk a little bit about the importance of having investment flows come into companies, that it's clear. You mentioned earlier that it has to be very clear to investors what the parameters are. But obviously that is so that they feel comfortable investing in these companies. So what is the importance to your membership of having investment in these green and transitional companies?
Thank you for the question. Well, I think we know from SFAC that there is a large gap in investment, and I think it's been clear that Canada is struggling with its productivity and its economic growth. So I would go back to that, and that we have a $115 billion a year investment gap that Canada has to fill in order to deliver on our net zero and transition commitments. And so really when we speak to our members, what they're asking for is additional partnership with government to promote investment in innovative technologies, and also the clarity that investors are seeking to invest in these kinds of technologies. Brian?
And if I may jump in very quickly, I just wanted to note that the large majority of businesses in Canada are small and medium-sized enterprise, and they also need a lot of support as they try to green their operations. So we were happy to see in recent months and in the last budget some of the money that was owed to small and medium-sized businesses through the carbon rebate program actually flow towards those businesses, because that's another key pillar of our advocacy and of many of our members that are much closer to their communities across Canada.
We have
Absolutely.
15 seconds for a
that.
comment, I guess, yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, I just want to say that closing that $115 billion gap, I think having some guidelines, a clear taxonomy and disclosure will help direct the flow of capital to companies which are meeting those guidelines. So thank you for the work you're doing at the Chamber.
Well, that brings this panel to an end. I really want to thank all the witnesses for an excellent exchange. So we're going to pause briefly to onboard the two witnesses for the second panel, who are both on video conferencing, I guess. Madam Clerk. Yeah. Okay, thank you again. Nice to see everybody. Have a good afternoon. On reprend. Alors, nous avons deux témoins.
We'll start again. We have two witnesses. We have Eric Husher, who is appearing
from the UN.